Hi everyone, happy Sunday, welcome in. Hello. Hi Erin, happy Easter to all those who are celebrating. And I believe there are some other holidays happening too, like Passover and Ramadan. So I know it's a busy weekend for a lot of people. Oh, my captions are in the wrong spot. Oh, hold on. Oh. My Midwest is coming out with all my little opes. Sorry, friends. I thought I had fixed that before stream started. Now it's being spicy. Okay. Here we go. But yes, hello Erin and hello Lucha and Lattes. Welcome in. I see the Fawn and Games little wave. We're gonna be hanging out with Fawn later, which I'm really excited about. They're one of our guests. If any of you are new here or you don't know me, you've never caught one of my It Gets Better Ambassador streams, my name is Bee. I use they, them pronouns. And I am a queer and disabled Sims variety streamer, I like to say. And I focus on providing a safe, like sensory-friendly, queer and disability-friendly space. So that's a little bit about me. I was an ambassador last session as well, and I spent a majority of last session talking all about myself and my own queer experiences and all of the labels that I use and how they affect my life and things like that, which was really fun. But I had done one of my sessions as a panel where I got to talk to other queer people, and that was the session that resonated with me the most. I think just getting to talk to other queer people and make sure that there was like multiple different perspectives shared on similar topics and not just my own perspective felt really special and felt like more impactful. So when I signed up to be an ambassador this session again, I wanted to do all of my sessions as these little panels and presentations. Hi Malia, welcome in. Thank you for the follow, friend. Welcome. Another one of our most wonderful panelists for later. So yeah, today we're going to be specifically chatting about queer representation in video games. I fully nerded out on this presentation, so I have a lot to share with you all. Normally I like to spend a little bit more time asking you all how your weekend is going and things like that, but we have a lot of things to get through today. So I will say I'm happy to hear about your weekend. I hope that you're doing well. I hope that you're having a good, restful weekend. Feel free to tell me about it in chat if you have the spoons or the desire. But I am going to get us started pretty quickly today. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for today. So, like I said, if you're new here, you don't know me, my name is Bee. I use they, them pronouns. And I did a little background presentation on the subject, and then later we'll be getting into our panel. So to kick us off, a little quote that I thought was funny, I had actually found from the director of our It Gets Better Ambassador program, who helps us with everything, Stephanie, was quoted in an article, and it was a really good quote, so I included it here. And it says, LGBTQIA plus gamers want to see themselves in the games that they play. I've played games from a young age, and I often found myself in a heteronormative world controlling a character that did not reflect me. Gaming for me has always been about the endless possibilities, about exploring different worlds than my own, so to see the same social constructs play out in the gaming space disallowed that desire for escape. Now I find myself only drawn to games that give you those options to explore freely. Which I love because I really resonate with this. Like, for me, the games that stand out the most are the games where I feel like I do have that freedom to explore who I am as a person, whether that's like gender expression through the character creator or exploring different stories or anything like that. I'm very similar in that regard, that I don't like to play a lot of games that feel really restrictive. And if at any point you all have things that you want to share about games that you've really liked that have good queer representation, or your thoughts on any of the stuff that we're talking about, please feel free to do so. But yeah, a little bit of an overview of the research that I found was that there is about 21% of people in the games industry do identify as LGBTQIA+, so that is a good number of people in the game development world who identify as queer. However, the research also showed that up until recently, games didn't really reflect this in their content. So even though there was a lot of queer people working on these games, there wasn't a lot of queer representation in the games themselves. That didn't really carry over. But as time goes on, more and more games are coming out that represent queer people and stories, but overall the progress is a little bit slow. So what's the value of having queer representation in video games? I would say it's more than just making games themselves more fun for queer people, although that's super important, of course. Queer people just deserve to see themselves seen and experience like queer joy and things like that. But it's also this idea of giving safe virtual spaces for people to explore their queerness. You know, if you know me, then you know my favorite game is The Sims. And I think The Sims is known for being kind of almost a queer awakening for a lot of people. Because they have the opportunity to safely explore gender expression and safely explore queer relationships in a virtual setting where there's really no consequences. And that might just not be true in their day-to-day life in terms of how open they can be about their queerness in public. Another thing that came up as part of the value or importance is this idea of you can't be it until you see it. And I think that really hit home for me because there's a lot of queer identities that don't get represented in a lot of spaces. And people don't always realize that transness is an option, or that being asexual or being aromantic or any of those queer identities that are a little bit less publicly known and not as shown in media. We don't see those as an option, then we don't even know that that's a possibility. And then I think we wind up feeling like ostracized, right? Like we feel a little bit like we're the only ones, or maybe we're just broken or weird or something like that. But if we can see it on media that we're watching, whether that's movies, TV shows, or video games, it kind of normalizes it and shows us that it's an option. So I think that's really important aspect. And they talked a lot about this idea of like the current moment in history and leaving behind traces of queer people in our storytelling and in our history. I know it's really weird to think of yourself as part of a historic moment because you're just existing, right? You're just being. But you are part of a historic moment. There's a lot happening right now, a lot of anti-queer and anti-trans legislation, as a lot of us know. And one way we can leave our mark on history when people are looking back at this time in the future is through media. So it's really important that video games as a media, but all media, doesn't hide queer people and shows that we were here during this time. Hi Sam, welcome in. I hope you're doing well. Let me know if that shortening is okay, by the way. If you like the full username, is it Sam Kuja? Let me know if that's the right way to pronounce it, but welcome. And then there was this quote, and it was like, video game industry is very nascent. I really don't know, I've never heard of that word before until I read this, but they defined it as essentially the video games industry is going through its adolescence and growing up very fast at the same time. So it's a pretty new industry, but simultaneously it's moving very quickly. And so that has like a heavy impact on like the progress being made. Sam is good. Thank you for letting me know, of course. So like the video game industry used to be, and still kind of is, predominantly games were made by cis straight men and for cis straight men originally. Like if you think about the Game Boy, like it was made to be advertised to young boys. Nowadays, obviously, there's a ton more non-men in the gaming space. There's a lot more women and non-binary folks in the gaming space nowadays. but there's still like a lot of undoing with that being kind of the foundation that it was built upon. And so there's like a huge movement for better representation in video games. But game developers are in a weird spot right now where they get kickback no matter what they do. If they do a lot of queer representation, they get feedback that it's like too woke, or that gayness is being like pushed down people's throats, which is obviously not true. We're just trying to exist the same way that cishet people have been allowed to exist in media forever, but they do get that feedback and sometimes even get like harassed. Game developers will, if they include that representation. And then of course if they don't include that representation, then there's a super valid feedback from the marginalized community of, hey, like, can you improve your representation of queer folks? Hi Toasty, welcome in, how are you? So yeah, it's kind of in a weird spot right now. And ultimately, it showed that video games are uniquely important for representation because a lot of queer people use them to escape unsafe environments, and like explore like what gender and sexuality can look for them in a safe way. Hi Bubbles, welcome in. Doing well but exhausted, just working on existing. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Toasty is my partner, and we're moving in literally 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks now. It was 2 weeks on Friday, so if you've ever moved, you know how stressful that can be. So it's kind of like every waking moment is dedicated to either work or packing and cleaning, and so it's definitely a tiring point for us at the moment, but it'll be worth it in a couple weeks when we're in our new house. And then aside from the representation specifically of the media itself showing showing queer people in video games and queer stories, we've also found a lot of community in the gaming sphere. We've even come up with this kind of playful thing of like gaming with like the GAY. And so like that can be like Twitch communities, Discord servers. There's more queer activities at gaming cons, like TwitchCon has drag show, and even queer teams in the competitive gaming scene. So it's really become a big queer hub in the gaming sphere. I know for myself, when I first started getting on Twitch, I was looking for queer community because it was the beginning of the pandemic and I lived in rural northern Wisconsin, so my options for finding in-person queer community were pretty limited. So that's how I wound up even doing all of this, so it definitely had an impact on my life in that way. Pushback that people give to this yeah, exactly. What is really interesting is that this representation can be viewed from so many different lenses for different genders, sexualities, ages, races, people with different levels of disabilities, etc. And the pushback from that people, cis white men, give to this representation sometimes is very weird. But yeah, there's still a lot of homophobia and transphobia in the gaming sphere, as represented by that pushback, but it is improving overall. And then it kind of like goes into what goes into a queer game. So I would say, and if you all have any other ideas of what you think makes a good queer game, feel free to share. These were just the things that I could think of. But I think that a flexible character creator, where you can explore your gender and not in a binary gender system, in terms of like, you know, that can also include like body representation, skin tone, representation, you know, piercings, tattoos, all kinds of things, disability representation, like just a very flexible character creator where you can see yourself, whether that's what you actively look like in person now or what you would like to look like or what kind of gender expression you would like to explore. And then pronouns, I think, should be available for you to select. Even better if you can customize your pronouns and if you can have multiple sets of pronouns, and include neo-pronouns. Because I think a lot of times we're seeing now like he, him, she, her, or they, them. And obviously the addition of they, them is really great because for a long time there was no non-gendered options. But it's really not fully representative of, the entire queer community. Hi, Kale. Thank you for the lurk and work. And good to see you as well. And Bopachu, thank you for the follow and thank you for the pronoun check. My pronouns are they, them. But if any of you feel comfortable and willing to participate in the pronoun check or the pronoun party in the chat, please feel free to do so, just so we can get to know each other a bit better and make sure to respect one another accordingly. Other things that I think are important for a queer game include queer romance options if the game already has a romance system. I don't think you have to have queer romance if the game doesn't have romance to begin with, but if it does have it, I want the option to be able to romance in a queer way. I wish this would include polyamory in more places as well, because I find that a lot of games have queer representation in terms of I can romance like whoever I want in terms of gender, but I often am limited to a monogamous version of romance, as well as having like trans and non-binary characters to romance is really nice, because a lot of times as someone who's like mostly T for T, which is like trans for trans, that there's not a lot of trans characters in a lot of games to be able to romance. The live captions, I love the oh yes, of course, these are pixel chat captions. I think most people who stream on this channel do have captions of some sort, unless the technology is being feisty, so hopefully that should help. And also, hi Fawn. Fawn is another one of our wonderful streamer pals who is going to be joining us for the panel later. And then I think also having queer NPCs, queer narratives, and stories throughout is also really important, that it's not just like my self-insert of queerness into the game, but that there are actual queer people already built into the game to begin with, and that it's not just NPCs are unimportant, like unplayed characters. Not that NPCs are unimportant, but you know what I'm trying to say, like there should also be queer main characters and main like stories. And then lastly, but definitely not like least in any regard, queer representation should be intersectional, include multiple perspectives. So it's not enough to just represent, like a lot of times the representation of queer folks in video games is a very white, cis, able-bodied representation, a very like US-based representation. And if you really want to have like good representation, then you're going to need to be a little bit more thoughtful about the intersectionality of it and have multiple different perspectives represented, and complicate kind of the stereotypical narratives you think about having for queer people. There's a lot of quotes in this presentation today because there was a lot of really good ones, so forgive me for that, but I thought they were powerful and I just wanted to take them word for word rather than altering them. So this says, although self-transformations are expensive, example, gender-affirming surgery, or difficult to perform on our physical bodies, nowhere is self-representation more flexible and easy to transform than in virtual environments where users can choose or customize their own avatars, digital representations of themselves. So I talk about this a lot in reference to The Sims, but it's true with a lot of games that it's a great way to be able to explore gender expression via like an avatar, via a character creator. It's one of the main ways I see a lot of queer folks get a lot of benefit out of video games. Yeah. And then what are the risks of making your game very queer forward? I would say that we talked about this a bit and it kind of touches on what Aaron was saying in the chat, but some gamers, predominantly white, heterosexual, and male, feel threatened by the introduction of queer stories or queer representation in games. So there was an example of The Last of Us Part 2 being presented at E3, and it had like a queer kiss in it, and there was a lot of negative feedback from that community saying like social justice warriors were forcing gay politics and agendas down their throat. Obviously that's not actually true and actually what's happening, but that is kind of the feedback that developers get sometimes. And this quote really resonated with me in terms of like how that might feel for the queer community when we see that. So it says, yet as much as it was a victory, it also felt like a frustratingly small one. One queer kiss in a trailer, one queer relationship in the game itself, and even this limited amount of representation still elicited such an aggressive, reactionary, and violent response from some gamers. All this points to is how much remains to be done in building an equitable, diverse, and inclusive space in games and beyond. So it's kind of like this where like even when the representation isn't that thorough, isn't that good, it still elicits such a negative response. And that's what can be really frustrating for the queer community, that we don't even feel like we're getting a full, thorough representation of ourselves, and yet it's still being criticized as being too much or too in your face kind of thing. I feel this. I'm a cis male, and because I have Animal Crossing, I can experiment with different gender performance through clothes without worrying about being stared at or questioned by my family environment. Exactly. And I explored a lot of queer relationships via video games when I was younger, before I knew what the words were or knew how to communicate with anyone that I was exploring different gender presentation or performance. So yeah, it can be good for literally everybody. Not everybody thinks of it in such a positive light, I would say, as you, Babachu, but it can be. It can be good for everybody. So let's get into the nitty-gritty with the time that we have. The research I took a deeper dive into the research. Like everything else was sort of an overview. But this part really talks about they went over some of the statistics and things. And essentially, research shows that there are more games with LGBTQ representation than ever before, but that is more so because there are more games than ever before. Not necessarily because the portion of queer games is increasing. In fact, the proportion of queer games that contain queer content has remained small and pretty stagnant since the 1980s, which I found surprising. And I'm going to go on to explain why this might be surprising for other people too, and why we might need to further interrogate this idea that video game representation of queer folks is getting better. So the article entitled "Queer Lives Are Not Side Quests" essentially dives into this idea that a lot of the other research done prior to their research doesn't have a very good definition of what should count as queer representation. So when they're giving percentages of the amount of games that include queer representation, there's not really a consideration for whether or not that queer representation is good representation, right? So there can be queer representation in a game, and it can be pretty poor representation, and a lot of those stats still include that game. So examples of not very good representation that is often still counted is things where there's only like one small queer side character that you could miss. Even a passing reference or a joke about queerness has sometimes been included in those types of studies, and how that can be really harmful because jokes are not even always queer friendly jokes. Sometimes they're harmful jokes. And so when digging a little bit deeper, we find that there's still very few games with queer content that is front and center, almost like they're very proud to have that queer representation in the game, and that queer folks were like the audience that they had in mind. This says queer video game characters have an immense amount of potential to challenge normative narratives and render new modes of existence possible. Making meaningful change to representation means giving queer people the chance to stand on their own rather than necessarily being part of somebody else's story. So yeah, that was kind of the premise for the article, is this idea that queer characters are often presented as a side quest or a side story or an NPC, and not often as a main part of the story. Some will try to do the bare minimum and put the checkbox. Yes, exactly. Treating it like a checkbox, treating it like like almost tokenizing queerness in a way. Forks are free. Thank you for the follow. Welcome in. So then the question becomes, how can queer narratives be meaningfully represented in video games? Like, how can people do better? And the quote reads, to do so, they must be purposeful. They need to relate to the queer audience and bring marginalized folks to the center. Ultimately, video games historically and today have not done a good job of representing queer folks wholly, honestly, and responsibly. So meaningful representation should look like it should be produced or co-produced by queer folks in an ideal setting so that they can get paid properly for their labor and get the when it comes to like their resume and things like that, like queer folks should definitely have the be able to be the one who's at the forefront of telling those stories and getting paid for that work. Hello, you just showed up on the recommended and I love some good queer talk. Heck yeah, welcome in, friend, welcome in. This is the It Gets Better page. It Gets Better is like a nonprofit that helps queer youth, mostly youth being defined loosely into like early 20s, but it is a page where there's like different queer ambassadors who will come on and they'll give different chats about things or just play video games with the queer community. So welcome in. Hi Amethyst. And if you all don't know me, by the way, my name is B. I use they, them pronouns, and I do have my own page where I also do queer chats amongst playing video games, so it's good to have you all here. Today we are chatting about queer representation in video games, and we have a little panel later on. So yeah, back to like what would make, I guess, a video game have good, meaningful representation. I would say, additionally, you would want to avoid straight-washing queer content or rendering queer content as optional. So it kind of reminded me of this like kind of pivotal moment in the Sims community earlier this year, and I'm using The Sims a lot as reference because it's the game that I play the most. But if you all have examples of stories from games that you all play that you want to share as good or bad representation, feel free. But there was this point where we added pronouns into the Sims community, and they added additional gender settings into the capacity for building your characters. And some angry consumers, like people who didn't like the integration of queer people into the character creator more and more. Obviously, there was already some of that, but there was more of it now, and they didn't like that. They asked if it was possible for it to be turned off. And I really liked the Sims response because they basically said, like, no, because queer people cannot just be turned off or put away in real life. And that's what made it feel like a more authentic representation or a more authentic caring about the queer community rather than making it possible for people to straight wash the game or render queerness as optional. It felt a lot more meaningful and I think had a really positive impact on a lot of queer people in the Sims community. And it should be queer people as your predominant audience rather than necessarily trying to add queer stories to a game that's mostly for a straight or cis audience. If you can't have someone produce or co-produce, like a queer person produce or co-produce, I would question that, but also like if we're just going to be realistic that sometimes that's not going to happen, then I would say that you should at least be willing to hire a consultant to help you make sure that your game is good queer representation, make sure that you're paying them, and make sure that you're ready and willing to change your artistic vision or your game. If you're a game developer and you're having a queer person consult on the authenticity of your representation, sometimes people like to bring in a consultant, but then they don't actually want to listen to that person, which is really not helpful at the end of the day. So making sure you're ready to be open to that feedback before you take it in, you're going to get the most value for the money you're spending, and the queer representation is going to improve in your game a lot. I wish I could turn off my gender sometimes, but unfortunately that's not what the naysayers meant. The nice thing is you can always go for like a more genderless vibe as well, but I get what you mean. And then it says, like, I really liked this quote where it was like the same storylines as any other character, where their queerness is visible but incidental. And to me, that really made me think of Unpacking. I don't know if any of you have ever played Unpacking, but it's an indie game where you follow a person as they unpack throughout their life at different points in their life in their little houses. So like you see them as a kid, and then as they move as a kid, and then like as like a university student age, you see them move in with like different partners, and like settle into a final spot kind of thing. It's a very cute indie game if you haven't checked it out, but it reminded me a lot of that because the queerness was very visible in the game, but it was incidental. Like it didn't feel forced. It didn't feel forced. It felt very natural. It felt very much like the queer people in that story got to be whole people. Sometimes I feel like in certain representation, in certain video games or media or TV or books or things like that, the queer person is just the queer person, if that makes any sense. Whereas I feel like this quote is touching on the fact that queer people should get to be whole people with passions and interests and friends and flaws, and like be just as complex as their like cishet counterparts in movies and in video games. And a lot of times I feel like that doesn't happen, and I think this quote is saying for meaningful representation, queer people can't just be your token queer person. They need to be able to be like a whole person, fully represented throughout, like just as complex and beautiful and complicated as any other person in your story. Yeah, I heard or read somewhere that not all queer stories should have to be coming of age stories where they accept their identity, and that really resonated with me. Right, like that part of queerness is an important part, but there's like sort of certain stereotypical stories that we tell over and over and over again, and queer people deserve to be represented in a more complex and authentic way than that, you know? And then last but again, certainly not least, intersectional representation. If you want your representation of the queer community to be meaningful, then you have to represent more than just white, cis, able-bodied, gay men or lesbians, to be honest. I feel like those are the communities that get the most representation right now. And while that's super like valid and important, I'm not saying to stop representing that community. What the article showed is that, and we'll get into a quote that kind of like reflects this, but while there has been an increase in queer representation overall, there are a lot of intersectional groups that are not represented. Okay, so like in the article they talk specifically about one of the most underrepresented groups being queer trans men of color are not represented in like almost any of the video games that we see. So even though you might say that queer representation overall has increased, that kind of falls flat if you still can't see yourself in game if you're like a queer trans person of color, or queer trans masked person of color specifically. So this was the quote. It said, "We certainly do not contend that representation in gaming has not improved at all, or even that it has not changed in positive ways in recent years. The data shows clearly that representation is constantly changing and more games with queer content are being produced than ever before. Yet we can see alongside that progress that there are still identities, communities, and people who are left out, and their experiences are therefore erased. The common refrain that representation is improving rings hollow when you can still only find a few stories like your own, if you can find any at all." And so like that really shows the importance of intersectional representation of the queer community. So I can give an example for myself that the reason I think Unpacking also hit really home for me was because it told a queer disabled story. whereas I feel like I don't see a lot of disability representation in the queer stories that I see in games otherwise. And I'm sure if I was Jewish that would feel even more impactful, because the main character in the story is queer, Jewish, and disabled, and that's a very different experience than someone who's just queer and that kind of thing. So that's where it goes to show that like the intersectionality of it is really important, and that relates to showing the complexity of queer people that we were talking about earlier. Another key finding in my research was that indie game developers are doing the most to advance queer representation in a whole and authentic way. And this is true for other forms of representation as well. And this is a really beautiful thing because it means that people have access to more queer games and more games with good queer representation, but it's also indicative of a more, like a larger, more, like harmful system. And what I mean by that is like indie game companies, indie game developers are paid the least amount of money for their work and for their labor. And so even though they're doing the most to advance representation in the gaming industry, they're not reaping the benefits from that work. And so it says here, like, another example of inequity in terms of labor and payment for the real life marginalized people who are trying to make games more representative for the marginalized community audience. And indie games are often harmed by discoverability, so like it can be harder for them to get on big platforms like, you know, itch.io or Steam or Epic Games, like these bigger platforms where people typically find their games. It might not always be easy for indie games to, get to be a part of that. And so even though they're improving the queer representation, it's like, can the queer people find the queer games if they're indie games that have a hard time getting their game out to everybody, if that makes any sense. So an interesting element of it as well. And this is your regular reminder to definitely check out more indie games and follow more, social media platforms that share indie games works if you are a queer person or a marginalized person and you want more games that you feel more representative. It's like a good mutually beneficial thing because you get access to games where you feel more seen and more represented, and also you benefit that indie developer who is trying really hard to do that work. And a lot of times indie games are a lot cheaper than like regular like large scale game developers, so you can also benefit in that way. And some indie games are even free, so definitely explore the world of indie games if you haven't. And this was kind of the concluding thing of the research. So the conclusion said, finally, and perhaps most importantly, the way to change representation is to change the dominant narrative that representation is already improving. This prevailing belief needs to be revisited and interrogated if we are to advance meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion in games. If we don't critically measure, quantify, and qualify representation in games, we might start to feel complacent about the supposed inevitability of progress. Our data in queer video games suggests that this complacency can be dangerous, hiding many aspects of representation that continue to be stagnant or exclude people. Ask yourself, when you're thinking about this, how is it improving and for whom specifically? And that kind of relates back to me saying like, oh, I was kind of surprised to find out that the research actually shows that queer representation is pretty stagnant or not that much better. I think I personally had fallen victim to kind of this idea, this prevailing belief that, oh, it's improving. Like people say it's improving, so it's improving, right? But the reality is that more games are being made, so the proportional amount of queer games isn't increasing that much. And I, as a white person, might feel like the representation is improving for me, but that doesn't have like an intersectional lens to it. And so there are other people in the queer community who aren't going to feel like they're actually being represented, even though supposedly the representation is improving, right? So I urge you all to be a little bit more critical of that. And if you see that narrative being spread, maybe help push back on that a little bit so that we can continue to push for better representation, because we recognize that it's not as good as it could be. That is all for my little nerdy presentation on where we're at with queerness in video games as of right now in 2023. I had a ton of fun building this presentation and looking into the research and thinking about queer games that were impactful to me and why they were impactful, and kind of interrogating my own even some of my own biases and misunderstandings about things. And we are going to slide into a really fun segment with some panelists who are going to share their own experiences, which might be different or similar to mine. I guess we'll find out. Hi, friends. Hi, V. Welcome in. Thank you all so much. Thank you for the kind words. I had a lot of fun. I remember having like kind of a moment while I was doing this presentation, just feeling really grateful that this is the type of work that I get to do on a daily basis. So I really appreciate that. Thanks for the presentation. This is kind of off topic, but what do you use to make your presentation? Oh, this presentation was made on Google Slides. And I got my design. I think it's called Slides Carnival. Has like a bunch of free like PowerPoint templates for either PowerPoint itself or Google Slides. And there's a lot of like cuter ones than like the base ones that come in either PowerPoint or Google. So here you go. Hopefully that's helpful to maybe more people than just Erin. And it looks like they're working with Canva now too, so tons and tons of good interactive presentations on here. You can actually see what platforms they're good for underneath each one. That's cool. I didn't know they started working with Canva too. Okay, cool. I'm gonna put the BRB screen on and get our guests hooked up. This can sometimes be a little bit of a technically difficult thing to do, so bear with me for the fact that it might take me a second, so we might be on the BRB screen for a minute, but we will be back with our guests to chat more about queer representation in video games. Take this time to stretch. If you need meds, take your meds. Hydrate, get some water, like all the good things that you might need to check in with yourself and your body. And we will be right back. Thank you all.
Can you hear us? Yay.
Hello.
Sounds good.
Good. A little itchy. I'll be right back.
Enjoying your panels so far, B. I was like hanging out while I was putting on makeup. I was like, because I had to like run back here from, I forgot it was like Easter, and my people are just hanging out, you know, like family. So I had to run back. Yeah. Yay! Love it when things work. That's the best. Always good when things. Ay, ay, ay. When we put our names into the caption, is this one of the spaces we should have our pronouns in, or are our pronouns somewhere else already? So.
Okay, let's see if it works. It is working, but see.
Oh, sorry, connect. Allow. Hello.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah.
I've still wanted to use these ones because I haven't had one I love for like multi-person. I used to use one called Web Captioner where everyone had their own and like we would put the little boxes in, but it ended up having like it was too much for the person creating them because they were one person. This was years ago, right? Like they were pretty early into the having them for like production and stuff like that, and then they clearly it was too much and they like kind of shut it down and like it was no longer as available. So I need to try these ones.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
I never realized that I had an accent as like a Canadian until I started using like Pixel Chat, and it just did not pick up certain words that I was saying. Like I had no idea.
I think so. Do the captions still work if I'm not on that screen? So, wait.
Hello, friends. I think I have everybody set up, chat, but you all have to let me know if anybody's too quiet. I can turn them up or down. And yeah, so I also have the Pixel Chat caption set up, but with alongside every other time we've kind of done this, just a reminder, they do get a little frozen sometimes. And what I mean by that is they get stuck on one person's last message and they don't want to go on to the next person. So they might be a little bit delayed, but they are the best multi-captioner we have access to right now. So I do apologize for that. But they are working. They're just a little bit feisty. Let's see. I think that's it. Also, hi, Kat. Welcome in. Welcome in, friends who have just joined us. We are just sliding into the segment where we are chatting with everybody and our panelists. So I'm going to have each of you introduce yourself a little bit. You can give your name, your pronouns, what kind of work do you do online, what kind of content do you like to create. You're here doing this for free, so take this opportunity and hype yourself up, because I know sometimes content creators are like, no, I don't do anything on the internet, I don't know what you're talking about. But not today. And I'll just have Malia go first because you're the first in the little like faces, if that's okay.
Oh, cool. Well, I'll answer the first question, anemic cat, or it's not really a question. It's from Target. This jacket is from Target, and I love it so much. So speaking of jackets and style, I am Malia Janae. I am a she, her. My pronouns are she, her. I'm pansexual, so one of the things that I really like to do is just kind of be open and honest with a lot of people, and just kind of really find good vibes from those people. And so for me, like I express that through fashion and gaming. And I used to do DBD and I kind of still do, but I also do just chatting and fashion. And now I'm somehow in Stardew and I don't know how I got here, but somehow I'm a cozy girly now. And we're playing tons of Stardew right now. And I absolutely adore it.
Listen, sometimes the content just takes you where the content wants to go. Whether you know or not, we're vibing and you're having a good time, and it's a new era. I love to see it. V, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Hello, my name is V. I'm a half Vietnamese Canadian non-binary kind of like streamer, cosplayer, activist, slam poet. My pronouns are they, he. Um, I find a lot of the work I do online is like educational streams that I will do sometimes, and I host a Trans Day of Remembrance vigils like every November 20th. Coming up 4 years now. So
Nice. I'm grabbing y'all's links, but feel free to hop in. Fun.
Oh, hi. I'm Jess, or Fawn. I go by Fawn in games in most places online. My pronouns are they, them. I am a queer Canadian non-binary neurospicy variety streamer. Gotta practice that one to say it all at once. And yeah, I really, really love highlighting and showcasing, in particular, indie games by and for marginalized voices as much as possible, as often as possible. Showcasing those stories and those voices that we haven't gotten to hear enough of, that we need to hear more from. That kind of stuff is my whole jar of jam.
It sounded great out loud too, but all of you did. You're all lovely. I know, like, sometimes I feel like as a streamer, I feel like this obligation to have like all of my words come out of my mouth perfectly. And that's just not the case on my actual stream. And it's not the case here. So don't feel any pressure here. It's just as head empty, no thoughts over here as it is anywhere else. But you all are lovely. I'm excited to hang out with you all. I was excited for today's panel because you're all three people that like I have in my circle but haven't had a chance to be in a space like this where I can like face to face like actively chat with you. So I think that's going to be perfect. So before we get into it, you all touched on this a little bit. But feel free if you didn't touch on it in your introduction or if you want to elaborate more, kind of to talk a little bit about what queer identities like you hold close to you that are important to you. And I can kick us off. So I've been on this channel for almost a year now, so I think a lot of you know me, but if you don't, my name is B. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as queer in general, but more specifically as non-binary, as a lesbian, as polyamorous, and ace. So lots of lots of the letters in the LGBTQIA acronym. And those are the identities that I hold close to me personally, and that kind of the reason that I ask you all to share that, if you feel comfortable, is so that people have a good frame of reference for what you're understanding or why you might answer other questions the way that you might based off of your own experiences. Because I think we have different understandings and we see different representation in video games differently based off if we see ourselves represented in them or not. And we'll just keep going kind of popcorn style from this point forward because I know there's sometimes questions people might not feel comfortable answering, so I don't want anyone to feel like they have to answer every single time. But I also know that we can be nervous lads sometimes, so feel free to pop in. It's okay if we accidentally talk, if we both go to talk at the same time, it's no big deal.
It took me a second to understand what you meant by popcorn style, and then I realized you meant pop up, and I was like, "That's cute as hell." Sorry, I like it. I love that, and I want to use it now.
My past teacher is showing because that's like a thing that teachers say, like popcorn style, like you can like pop in whenever you want, kind of vibes. But yeah.
I'm a go ahead and out myself now. Is definitely hands down the oldest one here. And so there's a lot of stuff where like. I like that was not a term when I went to school. So similarly, actually, because of that, because I like a lot of the games I love now, I did not have. I didn't have access to a lot of stuff like that. I didn't have access to media and stuff like that. So for a long time, I didn't have any words I liked. I didn't have anything. I was like, I'm just me and I just like whoever and I just do whatever and blah, 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 blah. And so now I tend to use queer for the reason that it's like, it's a word that I always loved. And then when I started hearing more people apply it to themselves and kind of it can mean so many things to so many people. So queer is the word I tend to now. Pansexual is the first word that when I was younger was the first time I like read a word and read the definition, and it was like, you like people for the people and you don't like parts for the parts don't matter, you like the person. I was like, holy butts, that's the first time I've heard this, because before then, I was a kid going like, what's wrong with me? I can't, I'm not straight because I like girls, but I'm not gay because I have dated boys. So what is this? Because there wasn't. So pansexual is my first word. Queer is my like go-to all the time. Now I am polyamorous. I am non-binary. I'm all over the place, and sometimes I got words and sometimes I don't got words. And on my channel we say hashtag not a words gay. That's not I can drive. Sometimes I can do math, but I'm not a words gay.
This is not relatable content to me. I am a words gay, but I support you.
Sweet. So I'll go next, I think. So I'm kind of different. I don't know. I'm probably not different, but I'll just yeah, okay. So as like growing up, I like did certain things that would make you think, "Huh, that's really weird that you would do that." Like wanting to kiss a girl goodbye. And I was like, "Huh, that's not weird. That's just I don't know, that I just like them a lot, I guess, like, as a friend." And then it was just like as I got older into the streaming space, like, I started learning what queerness is because in my city, you didn't really have many gay people or queer people, and if you did, it was like, "Ooh, he's, like, cheerleading. Ew, he's, like, doing something different," and that was kind of my experience, not, like, stereotypical things, but, like, mostly in my school, it was just very derogatory when it was like that, or in my family, it was very derogatory. So growing up in that, I never even thought of that. I was like, "I'm a good kid. I can't be gay. There's no way." Um, and hopefully that doesn't trigger anyone in weird ways, but, I basically got into the streaming space and I was like, "Well, pansexual actually makes sense. I'm married to a man, but, like, I don't really I don't know, I don't see him as a man necessarily, like, I just see him as a person, and I see people that I like as people, and I don't really identify them as, "Oh, I don't like you because you're a woman," or, "Oh, I don't like you because 'cause you're a man," or "You're whatever you want to identify yourself as." I don't care about that, I care about your personality, and for me, that's just kind of how I've identified, and I don't feel like I feel like I'm still very, like, towards the male portion of attraction, but there's, like, certain women for me that just make me feel so good, and I want to love them so hard, and whether that shows up in friendship, whether that shows up in relationship, I just really think that pansexual has identified exactly who I am, and I thought that was pretty cool to learn, in my 27s. I'm 28 now, so last year. So I'm a really baby queer, like a tiny one.
Just a little one. Just,
A little one.
I put Malia on my shoulder.
Yeah. Hello. I got shoulder pads.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I resonate with, and I came out and I like I said all these labels that I use, but like that's definitely a later in life learning process for me. Not that I'm like I'm only 25, but not that it's like that late in life, but I would say like similarly, like at school, it wasn't a very like well talked about thing. Like I did not have verbiage for it. I just had feelings, right? And now I've gotten to the point where I've become very like integrated into the queer community, wanted to understand the different labels that other people might hold so that I can understand them better and understand other parts of the community and uplift and be encouraging as, even towards the identities that I don't necessarily hold myself. Now I feel like a lot more well versed in all of the words, but for a long time it was just like feeling off, feeling different, feeling. And then it turns out all of my friends are queer, but we just didn't talk about it. We didn't know it. We flocked together without like really having that fully understanding of why that was until much, much later. So definitely understand what you're trying to say, and that like, you know, the verbiage comes later for a lot of people.
Yeah. You're like, "Hold the phone. You are too? Hello? We're both queer? Hello?"
Being demi complicated that as well, because all of my like it took me a long time to like figure out feelings with anybody, let alone, what putting labels to what that meant. So for sure. V,
Yeah.
V, do you want to share?
Yeah. Um, so th I definitely use, like, queer as more of, like, an umbrella term, for myself to encompass, like, all my identities and stuff like that. I also use, like, non-binary in a sense as an umbrella term. I don't really relate to any sort of, sorry, like, gender in general. Um, I'd say I lean more on, like, the trans masculine side of things, but, like, I'm not a guy, and I'm not like, I'm just a little guy,
Yeah.
but I'm not a dude, but I'm not, like, you know? Um, I came out, like, 9 years ago, and I remember up until that point just feeling like different, but not being able to like super pinpoint it. I grew up in like I went to a Roman Catholic like junior high, um, and everything like that, and then I went to public school. And one of my friends was like, "I need your help researching my gender and sexuality." And I was like, "I love research." And so I was presented with like a whole host of terms and words and was like, "Oh, that's what that feeling was." Um, and then finding myself like in those words that I found initially. I feel like I had a bit of a weird like opposite experience to a lot of people where they're like, "Oh, that's what I am," and then they get like the terms that they feel comfortable with, and I ended up with like a whole bunch of terms and then was like, "Ah, yes, now I get to like pick and choose what feels proper down the line." In high school, I was dubbed in my friend group the gay whisperer. Because after I came out and found all my words, I helped all my friends come out and find words and definitions that, like, helped them understand themselves a bit more. It was a fun little vibe.
I
I
love.
love your researching vibe.
Just sit down. We're gonna figure this out. We're gonna find the term. Let's go.
No.
Yeah, basically.
I feel that way as a streamer sometimes. The amount of people who come into chat like unsure what's happening, and then as we have like more and more conversations, they're like, "Ah, I figured it out," and I'm like, "Welcome."
Welcome. I'm still doing that with, like, my friends today kinda thing, where I'll be like I will have, like, educational streams where I talk about, like, myself and my experience, and then some of my friends will DM me and be like, "Hey, uh" I'm like, "Ah, yes. Come, take a seat. Let's go on this journey together."
Oh my gosh. I
I
love
love it.
that. You remind me of my sibling-in-law, which I've had to learn, like, how to say, like, aunt, uncle in non-binary terms, which is very
Mhm.
interesting. My sibling-in-law is mask, and non-binary and is very, like and is very vocal about it, and loves education and protesting and helping people. Like, she sends binders, to people that want them, and, she does a lot of good sorry, they do a lot of good work, in that community, and I've really learned a lot from them. And you can make mistakes and you can accidentally mispronoun, or I don't know what it's called, um, misgender?
Yeah.
Is that the word? Um,
Misgender, yeah.
and but you just fix yourself, because I do it all the time accidentally, and then I fix myself immediately, and then I say it like 20 times, to remind myself that I was wrong that time.
Yes. Oh my gosh, Kat, you're unlocking like a childhood memory because like I got so much of my words from like online content creators who were sharing their experiences with queerness. And now full circle moment because now I am that content creator sometimes. Um, but yeah, so today I was really excited because obviously, like, all of us stream in some capacity or another. And all of us, play video games in some capacity or another. And I wanted to tackle this topic of queer representation in video games. So we're gonna just deep dive in. We only have a couple questions. I have learned from my last few panels not to type out like 20 questions because that's what my brain does, and then I'm like, there's an hour, B. I need you to have less time blindness of what we can actually accomplish in an hour's period of time. So just kind of kicking us off, I think it would be valuable to hear from you all. Kind of how has queer representation in video games been important to you, slash do you feel well represented by video games in general? Hi Sten, welcome in.
I guess I'll chime in. Sorry if I'm talking too much. I get really
You're good,
nervous.
you're good.
So as you can tell, I am a Black person, and as a Black queer person, um, it's for first of all hard, just like really freaking hard. But also like I can't remember what game it is. It's the one where you like walk around as a camp counselor and you're in the woods, and it's the new
Is it
one
the
from the
quarry?
yeah, the quarry, the quarry. Oh my gosh, the day that I saw Ryan and other dude make out, and everyone was like, "It's just so normal," and I was like, "Wow, that's like just so cool," because it's just like it's not like, "Oh my gosh, there is gays kissing. Oh my gosh, they are gay. Did you know that they're gay?" No, so it was just like it was so awesome because it was just built in the platform, and it didn't feel like different than, like, Emma kissing or someone else kissing. It just felt, like, really just integrated in, and they all had different stories, and actually, they were probably one of the more prominent characters in that game, and so for me, I saw that and I think Ryan is his name. He's also of African American background possibly, not assuming necessarily because I can't remember, but, um, seeing that was just, like, super cool, and then seeing just how well it was put in there was just like a breath of fresh air versus some of the other ones where it's like, "Oh my gosh, they are lesbians kissing. Look at that. We did inclusivity. We are diverse." And so for me, I think, um, being newly to the queer area and having the ability to do certain things outside of just here's straight homonormative things was really fun, as well as The Sims was my introduction to queerness because I was always going for the girls and I
So
didn't want any of the
many
guys.
people, The Sims, gay
The Sims.
awakening. It actually, what you're saying reminds me of one of the things that I read, which was it was talking about like one of the meaningful ways to represent like queerness in video games is to make queerness very visible but incidental is the way that they described it, in that like kind of tackles what you're saying where it feels more authentic. That queer person is a whole person. They have interests, they have hobbies, they have other things that they talk about other than just being like the token queer person to say you had one, you know, to say
Yeah.
that you had that representation. And it just feels different, I think, when you like go through it. I had kind of talked about, and I'm potentially ruining one of our questions for the future, but I had talked a lot about unpacking and how like the queerness in that story is very incidental, in that it is a part of everything else you're learning about that main character. It's not something that's like very forced, I would say. Yeah, like Sten said in chat, it as people who hold whatever marginalization is being represented, it's very easy to tell when it's been like forced in rather than something that's been really thoughtfully considered and like written well from like a queer perspective. But yeah, now I'm rambling. Who else wants to talk?
Um, sure, I'll go. Um, I feel like I also have a kind of like difficult experience finding myself represented in video games in general and then in queer video games. I walk a very weird line of being like white passing, but having grown up so much in my like Vietnamese culture and everything that um like I'm not immediately like clocked as that kind of thing. Um, but it's so intrinsic to like my identity and who I am, and I don't find a lot of like non-binary like Vietnamese protagonists or even like secondary side characters or things like that. And I think it's like it's so important that these queer representations are like intersectional in that way. Like, yeah, you can find like non-binary protagonists or like love interests or something like that um in certain games, but not a lot of them have that other like layer and that other field of depth that is needed to properly like represent everybody. I remember when I like played Slime Rancher, the ex of the main character's gender is like never ever referenced, and it's done in a way so that the person playing can view someone important in their life like in that character, which can cause like a very queer relationship to form while you're playing and while you're seeing, or it'll be like a straight relationship. But even that like subtleness of never mentioning this character's gender because it's meant to be like ambiguous for your player experience was just something so like special still, because I viewed that character as like non-binary, and so I viewed the vibes of it as queer, and that was kind of like the point, was that the people of like Manami Park wanted to have it be open to anybody and everybody to ensure that everyone has something, kind of thing. And that was important to me.
Yeah, that was one of the, I mean, there's multiple different ways to obviously show queerness, but having that open-endedness is nice because then like the player can really connect with that character in whatever way feels right for them in that moment, which I really like as well. I tried Slime Rancher and immediately got motion sickness, but I never knew that. I have the game downloaded and I played approximately 4 minutes of it and then was like,
Oh my
my god,
God.
I can never do this again ever again.
That's
Just
totally
Stardew.
fair. It's my life. That's a baddie slime from Slime Rancher 2. I also have a slime keychain
I love that.
and the Switch edition. I own Slime Rancher on every single console that I have in my house.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's my like main identity.
The hyperfixation is real.
We love it.
It really is.
We need emotes for slimes.
I actually hold on.
He's like, I have some actually.
Hold
on
a second. Because that is a follower emote right there of the lucky slime.
Oh my god, I love him.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I love Slime Rancher. If
Oh my
I
god,
could
you
just
have a
talk
bee
only
haw?
about it.
Oh my god, I'm sorry.
I
I got
do have
distracted by the bee haw.
No, you're so good. Yeah. If I could only ever talk about Slime Rancher, that's all I would ever talk about. Especially because Casey was also the first character that I was like, they're also Vietnamese. I've decided, because they're just like so open and like ambiguous, and it was nice to kind of put myself in a game.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts you want to share, Jess?
Yeah, sure. In terms of like, do you feel represented in games? I notice more and more, that we get, at least for me, and maybe it's because I lean towards indie games, and indie games, was so much more often. We get wonderful cases of people sharing their own stories. So much more often now, I do see really important special moments that I'm like, oh, this is so good. This is so meaningful. Like, I really love and feel good. And like, I feel something about this. And then I look back at some of my earliest things. I look back at like playing the first Dragon Age, like, years ago, and
you had the capacity to do that. Jess is
yeah,
fancy out here.
It's redacted, and and I can like remember being like, wow, this is so cool, because that was one of the first games I played where not only was there romance, there is queer romance, there's a bisexual romance, there's like, and you create your own character, so you do have something of a self-insert in a fairly big game. And but it's funny because like I look back on it now and I'm like, that wasn't enough. Like, that wasn't as good as it could have been. Like, that wasn't, like, and I'm like, it's great that was there. And I feel this so much and so often, that you should critique the media you love. It's not like, you know, don't critique things because you love them. No, you should critique the media you love, right? So that game was important. It did do good things. It did have like something that felt representative at the time, and now I look back at it and I'm like, no, not enough. Let's keep going. Let's keep moving. Let's keep pushing forward with this. And so do I feel myself represented in media? Like in small ways here and there. I do see it and feel it more and more. And I feel a lot of joy, and I hope to continue seeing more joy, but also give me more. Not enough. Give me more.
Yes, I agree. I think that we deserve to ask for more. I think a lot of the research that I did showed that there's kind of a prevailing idea that representation is getting better, and that vague notion is just kind of accepted, and that's it. Like, it's getting better, and we're just like waiting. And the reality is that when you start to pick that apart a little bit more, of like, in what ways is it getting better? For who is it getting better? And when you start to consider, like, the point was made that basically, like, people think that there are more queer games now, and there are, but there are also just more games. And so, proportionally speaking, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's actually more queer representation happening. And I was like, you know what? You're right. My bad. Like, I had kind of just accepted that. Like, not in the sense that I didn't want better for the queer community in terms of representation and other communities, but in the sense that I had just kind of assumed, like, yeah, it's getting better. But like you said, Jess, like, we can ask for more authentic, better representation, and we can be critical of the media that we consume, right? Like, I constantly talk about The Sims as a wonderful game, and a game that's getting better and over time, instead of just kind of leaving errors of the past in their game. I really appreciate that they're adding things like pronouns and adding gender capacities, but the game was still built 8 years ago on a gender binary system, and like, reflections of that still definitely show through in the game now. And it could still be better. So I still often speak about how, like, it could be even better than it is now. And I think sometimes people misinterpret that as not liking the game or thinking it's a bad game, and I'm like, no, it's doing a lot of great work, but it could be doing even better work. Yeah. A lot of you did this naturally, but I'm going to actually, you know what? Fawn messaging that person back in chat made me realize we did have a chat question. So before I move us on to the next question, they said, do you all feel like letting those relationships just be without calling them out as unusual helps normalize them without feeling exploitative? Which I think Iron might have been referring to when Malia was talking about the character in The Quarry. And I would say for myself, yes, because it relates to that concept of like being visible but not necessarily like being incidental as well. So it's not something that's like forced. It feels very natural. It's just part of life and therefore part of the story, rather than feeling, any kind of way. But I don't know if you all feel differently or have any other thoughts to Iron's question in chat.
I can go. So yes. Yeah, I think that's always great. It's always great to have stuff exactly like Malia said, that the fact that it was just there, and it could have been any kiss. It could have been a kiss between any of the characters, and it was just as valid. I think is so good and important. And seeing more stories where it's like, here's a bunch of people living their lives, and some of them are queer because, hey, guess what? That's life. Is so good. Setting like that should be just normal, because hey, it is. It's a lot of people's normal. Like, it is. I think there is value in naming things sometimes, in the same way that I think it is good for cis people to also have their pronouns on screen, in the same way that I think it's good for people to sometimes, expressly say that they are allosexual, because you shouldn't only have to say when you're asexual. You shouldn't only have to say when you're trans. You shouldn't only have to say, like, hey, guess what? This is a spectrum and everyone is what they are. So I think there is value in naming things. And I think there is value in, having those words available, because there's a lot of people that will learn and key in and clue in from those words. But I think it depends on the games. Like, some games are very literary, some games are very, you're just living an experience. And if the case is that you're just living an experience, then part of that lived experience should be queer, just inherently.
Yeah, I would also chime in. When you say call out, for me, that kind of sounds like, as content creators, when we like say like, "Oh my gosh, like look at this gayness, look at this queerness, this is amazing." And so from that take, I think so for example, I did a TikTok on it because I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's like, wow, they're kissing and it's amazing," and I was super excited, and it just was a natural reaction. For me, I think that's like any other person that has a fandom on any other thing, or like smut, reading smut, they're all like, "Oh my gosh, they read that. Oh my gosh, like they had sex, they were doing things." Um
They were woohooing.
They were woohooing. Um, they were woohooing or doing something like, that they've been anticipating for a long time. And for me, that during that game, there was like this anticipation of like, ooh, you're just like, you like him and that you want to be with him, and you guys are like doing this little flirting thing, and then it was just like a buildup of like your favorite character doing the thing that you've always wanted them to do for such a long time, but it took them like forever to do it. So for me, I think like calling it out is exceptional. I think, as any other fandom, I would call it out. As any other relationship that I've been dying to see, especially like Sarah J. Moss with Reese and what's her name? Can't remember. Fairy, whatever her name is. That's a book, but I just really love calling it out as any other person would, as a normal piece of life, as Swan was saying, just as a regular person versus as like a, oh my gosh, there's gayness, or oh my gosh, there's queerness. Look at this queerness, guys, with the like arrow, like, oh my gosh, it's so cool. But that for me feels good.
Yeah, no, I think when they say like calling out, I think they mean like without the game dev like calling it out and attention
Yeah.
to it like in the game, like letting it just be. But as queer people, obviously we have every right to be excited and call attention to and point out like those moments where that queer representation, it makes us feel good and excited and show that and share that with others so that more queer people can find that good representation and enjoy it and that kind of thing. But I think like when they say calling out, they mean like kind of having it in the media without it being like the main focus, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. Like just letting queer people be part of the natural story.
Yeah. I think that definitely don't put like a sticker that says, "Hey, queer moment."
Exactly. No, and Iron responded as well. They said, I 100% agree with that. Call out and point out the form of media if they did something good or bad. I just meant that the developers don't make an issue of it being a queer relationship. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Exactly.
But if it is the moment, can't we have a banner that just says the moment? Because like sometimes
You could be very very funny with it. I think that would be actually awesome if they
I
did
think
something like
it
that.
depends on like the game and if it feels right.
Yeah.
Like I think of oh, now I'm forgetting the name. Let me pull up my Steam because I am having a brain fart moment of the name. No, Validate. Validate is an example of like
Oh, yeah, yeah.
there are moments that are very queer and very gay, and that's like it is called to attention, but not in a bad way, in a very positive way, in a very like affirming way. And so I think if your game is like queer from the ground up, you can be loud about that queerness and that queer representation. But I think you just have to be careful that it doesn't. It's very context specific, and if it doesn't feel natural in the game, if this is like your only queer relationship, and then you're calling it out and making it feel othered, I guess. Like, you really want to avoid making that relationship or that moment feel like othered or different from the other relationships in the game. So it can really depend on the type of game and the context, which I think Fawn had kind of touched on as well. Depending on like what type of game you're playing can depend on what authentic representation would look like in that moment. It kind of has to
Yeah.
flow with everything else that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I'll definitely like V speak if you'd like to speak, but uh I was actually just randomly thinking like what do we think about good and bad interactions with queerness? Because obviously if there's normal interaction with queerness, then like there's obviously bad parts of queerness. And then how
Mm.
is that portrayed in games?
That's
Um
actually like a really interesting question, because I have like a mod. I have an LGBTQIA plus mod in my Sims to make the already queer game even more queer, because that's who I am as a person. Um, and there is like an on or off button option for like, do you want negative reactions to queerness being represented to like increase the authenticity, because it's a life simulator and that does happen. Um, and I wasn't too sure, honestly, when I first like, I think I have to be careful as a streamer that I don't want to like trigger anybody or put anybody through a hard thing that they're not expecting to, I guess, be put through. So I have mine off, but I feel like different queer people might feel differently on whether or not they want that represented in games or not. And I mean that to say, how do you all feel about it?
sorry I cut you off. I didn't know if you wanted to speak on that last one, sorry.
No, no, you're good.
Go ahead.
On the last one, I feel like we've definitely moved from like a point where it had to be like, this is gay, this is definitely gay, to being like, yeah, this is gay kind of thing. I see it a lot more with like TV shows and stuff. Like I remember back in the day watching like Glee and that being the only queer like representation, and it very much being like, this is gay, look at them being gay. And now like having watched like the Owl House, it just being so like, that's it, like this is it, this is like, this is queer stuff. And I feel like there's a lot of potential of like video games acting the same way as like early TV shows, of them being like, this is gay, this is gay, look at this. And then other ones of like them just being like, yeah, this is, there's a lot of queer stuff. And I would prefer if a lot of things move towards that, and it's very indicative of if they have like any queer people on their team, like from developing to writing, their artists, like literally anything. um I think it's great when it's called out, but I like it better when it's not the entire main focus of something that isn't labeled as being like a queer experience, like video game.
Mm-hmm.
Like if they were to just throw, I don't know, I guess like a good example is uh Dead by Daylight. They like had one of their characters, they were like, yeah, he's gay. And they made like a really big deal about it, and it just felt weird for the context of the game in a sense to me. Like I loved it, but the way they went about like announcing it was just so weird, because then it makes like all the other characters that you can play in that game straight, because you're gonna scream about your singular queer gay man. And it's, I feel like it's a very interesting vibe.
Contextually, it's weird too, because it's not like
Mhm,
the game resonates around story, right? There's no real like,
mhm,
I mean, every game has lore, and I'm not, a DBD expert, but I don't think it's a primarily story based game. It's more similar to like an FPS where you like do rounds. and it's different every time you play it and that kind of thing. So like it's kind of an odd choice to make such a big emphasis on this one character's story just because they hold like one particular marginalized identity.
Yeah.
I also do think that DBD is built upon like different identities, and like the audience like really wants different identities to be like there's a list, like this man's African, this one's Jewish, this one's white, this one's like this, and like there's just like a list of things that people will put on there. And if you're really into lore, like if you're super into lore, like my friend Chaotically, super into lore, like they know everything about that lore, and there's a group of people for that that like really resonate. And so I wonder if like in those stories, if it makes sense to the people who are in a ton of that lore, if that was geared towards them. Because what I see DBD do a lot is like say, hey, here's like this little piece that's for this little nugget of people. Here's this little nugget of people. And so sometimes I think that's hard. Um, I think it's really weird contextually for me because I don't look at the lore. I don't really read it. But like for someone else, maybe that's a good nugget for them. I don't know. I wonder.
I do read the lore. I love the Dead by Daylight lore. I think I would have preferred it like being in the lore to begin with.
Yeah.
And I think that's the issue, that it had been like a long-ish standing character, and then just kind of out of the blue they tweeted about it. And I
Yeah.
feel like if there had been more context like in the background lore
Ooh.
of this character being gay, it wouldn't have felt like such a weird little like, oh, Dead by Daylight has gotten into shit for like certain representation and now they're trying to like
Fix it.
be better. Like they've
Yeah.
just been called out for blackface and now they're trying to do this. And
Yeah.
it's very interesting. Dead by Daylight is just interesting in
For sure.
general, I feel.
1000%. And so is the
Yeah.
Twitter.
Yeah, they're whoever is running their social media, I never know if they should get a raise or if they need the password taken away from them.
Yeah. But also there's just I couldn't be their social I'm in marketing, but I couldn't be their social person because I get yelled at for literally everything. It's
Mhm.
like, "Happy Tuesday. What do you mean? What about Monday?" And I'm like, "Wait. Oh my
Well,
Yeah,
you've
gosh."
just
yeah,
described the
it's
community
really
manager experience in general, Malia.
I'm like, "Oh, please, guys,
Making
please."
everybody in any community completely happy in your game representation is never going to be an easy thing. And I think that that actually is a really important point to make, that like I think a lot of people in general, but specifically if we're talking about representation in video games, I think there is this tendency for people outside of any particular community to want to do things right, to get it right. And there's like almost a perfectionism mentality of like, I don't know if I want to touch this because what if I mess it up, right?
Mhm.
And I think any
Mhm.
game developer that's looking to tell authentic stories for marginalized communities, including the queer community, has to be open and ready to receive feedback that they might not get everything right. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't keep trying or that what they did put in was inherently like bad, depending on the situation. It just means that we're open to like growing and learning, and that's true for like regular individual people, but also these like teams who are running social media for games and things like that, that like you're not always going to get it right, and that the queer community is not a monolith, right? So there's going to be times where some of the queer community might be really happy with the way that you represented them, and then other parts of the queer community might feel really negatively about the way that they were represented. And so like, and that you're just going to have to be emotionally prepared to deal with that, because it's not this like there's no checkmark to-do list of how to represent people appropriately
Mhm.
in media. And I think sometimes people are, they're so afraid that they don't let themselves like explore and like try things, and that's, I mean, partially indicative of what I was talking about in the presentation, which is this thing that like a lot of game developers feel like they can't win no matter what, right? Because there's different there's different people who have different perspectives on how to do things, and you just have to recognize that not everybody's going to like you and not everybody's going to like your game, and that's okay. That's just life. That's just how it goes.
And not every story is for everyone. Like, not
Exactly.
it goes both ways, right? Where sometimes, like, hey, maybe this story isn't for me. Like,
And that
you
doesn't
know,
make it bad.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
I agree.
definitely.
This kind of ties well into the question of like, what ways do we think the game industry could be more inclusive in terms of representation and queer representation? Like, what things do we think could be better?
I would say just like being a Black person in this industry, there's not a lot of opportunities for us to be like content creators or people involved in the process. And honestly, as there's a whole group of people, an entire universe of people who are literally dedicated to making games like feel good or showing off and streaming games like the content creators that we are all here and readily available. If Square Enix said, "Hey, do you want to come on and like talk about queerness or talk about blackness?" I would be like, "Hey, yes, please. Where do I sign up?" I feel like there's just this untapped resource that they just kind of say, we'll just deal with them later. Um, like have more people to talk to, like instead of just building this game and then saying like, "Yep, I think we did a good job with like all white men in the room." Yeah, I think we captured queerness. I think we all captured blackness. I think we did it. Good job, guys. Instead of that kind of thing, I feel like there's this opportunity to say like, "Hey, look at all these content creators. Could we like get a bunch of you to come in and maybe look at our our rough draft? Like, what do you think about this? Like, do some testing." And I feel like they do testing, but it just isn't to the quality level that they need it to be. And there's just this really great opportunity to also market and get people invested in your game by just including the people whose lives are surrounded by games.
Mm-hmm. That community connection and feedback can be huge, and like having a feedback mechanism that's actually like accessible and actually has the potential to change the game. Because unfortunately, what I find is a lot of times there's like a push for like, yeah, like let's have some content creators, let's listen to what their experiences are, but there's like no intention of actually making any changes based off of that information, in which case I'm wasting my time
Yeah.
and I have better things to do. So
Yeah.
like invite us to the table, invite people who hold those identities to the table to give you feedback. Like that is a great suggestion, I think, Malia. But also tying into that, be willing to actually hear the feedback that your game might not be doing what you hope it's doing. Because I think a lot of times like the idea is there, but it reminds me of like corporate America where you're like in 1,001 committees and none of them actually have the power to change the things that you're discussing.
Yeah. I think Worka 101, I don't know what game he has, but he streams on and he develops the game on stream. But one of the things that we brought up or I brought up was like, "Hey, you have literally all white people on your game. You should probably think about diversifying." He was like, "Oh shit. That sounds like a great idea." And so he created some diverse characters. I don't think there's any like there's no story to those people, so there's no queerness to really identify unless you like put a pride flag on him, which would be really weird and awful. But like I thought that was a great opportunity and something that I think a lot of those game developers could even do.
Yeah, sorry, I would just want to agree and like add to that like bu also touched on this when you were doing, you know, your slides earlier and stuff like that, is bringing people to the table, but bringing them to the table early, like before you get too far in, like bring them in from the jump. Like if you have a thing, like check in with folks, check in with LGBTQI2 plus community, but like you said, also intersectionality in all things. So don't just stop there. Like you need to check with a bunch of people. You need to like, bring them on board early, do a check, and then I guess go back, do your building, check back in. It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing thing. Like you are building and growing and making something. So you need to be uh checking in, because every time you add to it, there's if you don't have a very full frame of perspective, there's a chance you could very easily miss something. It happens. It happens to everyone. You only can see what you can see, right? So that's why you bring more people in and you ask people to like help you with it and look at it and actually listen, like you said, because it is too common in a lot of games, in a lot of systems, in a lot of corporations, just in general, for people to tokenize marginalized people, for companies and games and media to tokenize marginalized people, where they said, look, well, we brought the we put this name on the thing, we added this name to it. And then if you actually speak to those creators later, if you actually speak to those people, they're like, they didn't listen to a word I said. I know
Mm.
several
Mhm.
people who have stories like that, who are like, yeah, I helped with that game and they put my name on it, but like they didn't, I told them that this was a problem, that they needed to bring someone in for this, and like none of it got done. So bring people in early and listen to them.
Yeah, Redmint in
Mhm.
chat said, like, don't make them feel like an afterthought. Like, you can't just
100%.
slap a bunch of like band-aids on a lack of representation on something, and if you're too far in the process, then it you might feel like it's unfixable, because then you'd have to fundamentally go back and do a lot of work over again. So if you bring them in early, they have the potential to make those changes while those changes are still possible. I talk
Mhm.
about that a lot in the disability scheme, because something that I see a lot, even in games, I'm going to use Coral Island as an example, a game that's doing a wonderful job with representation, but the entire early access had nothing in the accessibility panel. I can't give you any feedback as to whether or not your game is going to be accessible if it's something that I can't see until the game is fully done and out there in the world. It's very similar. I was thinking about like what you said, the with it comes to Slime Rancher and the open-endedness of the possibility for like self-insert or like insert of a partner or something like that. Um and I like that idea. I also do wish that something that companies would do better in their representation is more explicit representation of like underrepresented communities,
Mhm.
like that's very direct and clear, because I feel like one of the things that like the research was like talking about was like the ability to for people who aren't queer to essentially like avoid queerness in that way, of like being able to play through all of their games without ever seeing queer people, when in reality we are a part of everyday life, and video games could be doing more to like normalize that. um, so I would also
Mhm.
personally like to see more games where, like, it's not just that you could imagine to yourself and kind of decide that this character is queer, or decide that this character holds a certain identity because it's not specified. I would also like to see more games where it's very clearly specified, like, this character is a trans mask Vietnamese person, and everybody has to engage and play with that character the same way and see their
Yeah,
story for what it is.
100%. I think that's like one of my biggest complaints about the game. Like, I know why they did it, and it's because the storyline was never about like the gender, but about the relationship that was there and then was lost, and how you interact with that. And I get that that's why it's so ambiguous, so that you could like place yourself in the main character's shoes, and then that could be like any old friend, like an ex-lover or something like that, to really drive that home with you. But I really wish that like it had been solidified
Mm,
in that
mhm.
sense, or if they weren't going to solidify that character as being like non-binary, then including a non-binary character. um because they do well with like a host of representing like different people, like different body types, different races, different like experiences there, um, but end up lacking in that like solid queer representation.
Yeah, and I don't mean like specifically Slime Rancher because I don't know enough about the game to know if they're necessarily doing like a good or bad job. But in general, I feel like I I agree, and I think we're on the same page of like I just would like to see like those intersectional representations front and center as if they were designed for specifically those like the audience of people who would benefit most for them, and that if other people want to enjoy that game then cool, like you can, but that they're not as like an afterthought or that we have to fill in. Because I find myself, I kind of identify as like a queer storyteller in my content, in that I find queerness like wherever I can and I like incorporate it into any game. Like even like Animal Crossing, they're little like animal characters, but I've definitely like coded some of them as queer in my mind and talked about that
Mhm.
before on stream. And that process isn't inherently bad, but I think sometimes it comes out of the fact that there is no blatant queerness in a lot of the characters in most of the games that we play, so we have to like find it ourselves in those moments. And I would like us to not have to do so much of that particular work and for it to be a lot more clear cut representation from the beginning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, V, if you're
No.
Oh,
there.
no. I mean, I was just gonna say, like, hire these people from the very beginning, um, and even, like, consulting crews, like, outside hires, outside organizations reaching out rather than just, like, living in your own little bubble kinda thing, especially because sometimes if you hire people in, for that, like, representation and diversity, uh they can be scared of the repercussions of calling their, like, employers in for a lack of
Mm-hmm.
that representation and diversity.
It's also not their job a lot of times, right? Like, if you're
Yeah.
not the consult that's there to talk about representation, I don't want to be asked to do all these extra job tasks as your like token queer person. Because even when I was in education, that would happen, right? Like, we'd have a queer student struggling with a problem, and then it'd be like, "Oh, B, like, what are we supposed to do?" Like, you're the manager. You tell me what we're
Mhm.
supposed to do.
Mhm.
Like, obviously I didn't say that because I care about that queer kid and I want to help them, but there is like this expectation sometimes of marginalized people who's like, the queer artist in your game shouldn't be expected to also be the queer consult on the writing, on the like all these other
Mm,
things that aren't in their job description, kind of thing.
Unless you're gonna pay them for both,
yeah.
True.
don't ask for that labor from them.
And give them credit for that as well in all the ways that would
Mhm.
help them be able to further their career.
Mhm. This is like back to the original question of like what can like games do and that sort of stuff, representation. But also it came up in my mind, and I just didn't want to like interrupt earlier when you were talking about when you were discussing DVD, and that moment where it can be a little bit difficult for a game where like DVD where you're not it's playing their story. The story is either in the background and you're kind of playing the characters, and so it's like how does the true matter of the fact is, you all said it already, they should have thought about it from the start, and that should have been part of the character from the start, so that we didn't have to have that discussion later where here on social media we said it, they're queer. So someone who I think has done it from the start, and I think this is one that I don't know if this comes up enough, and I want to bring them up, is Bungie, who makes Destiny 2, which is not a game you would think of. It's a first-person shooter game in space with aliens and stuff like this. But Bungie has always had queer characters in Destiny. They've always, from the jump, had so many and such a variety too, like trans characters, queer characters. Canonically, it's had stories of their romances in the lore in the background, but also, like you said, B, like I want it to be something where people can't avoid it. Like I love Stardew Valley, but it's also true that if I am not being gay, there's not enough gayness happening. Like
Agreed.
there's just not enough.
Mhm.
So in Destiny, in this new season, for example, one of the main characters, who is leading the story, they're non-binary and very like it's not a thing. It just is who they are. Like it's just they're non-binary. And there's another wonderful example is like two of the main NPCs who are like part of the main story are two old gay men. Like they're not two young beautiful people. It's two old grumpy guys. Like it's two, and they're wonderful. They're like our dads. We love them. Like so they have an actual like variety of characters. Like, and it's not something you see all the time. It's something they kind of just let be. They give you more if you want to read the lore, if you want to read the stories. Then there's beautiful stories where these two old men like share poems with each other, and that's how they romanced, and it's so freaking sweet if you want to go have it. But otherwise it's just the two of them scolding each other on the side on your comms, or you'll be in a mission, you'll be shooting, you'll be in a fight, and one of the other characters, he'll be talking with another we'll say Devram is talking to Amanda, and Devram's like, oh, that sounds great, I'll bring my husband, let's go out for dinner next week. Like you know what I mean? Like they just have it inherently in the game. And more so than that, when it does come up, when social media happens where people are like, stop doing this, they're like, no. They literally have on several occasions said, no. Why do you got to force this in? We're not forcing anything. That's who these characters are. No one's like, half of our staff is like that, actually. So what are you going to do? Like Bungie has like
I love the defensiveness, like be ready to like stick up for your queer community, because like that means so much as well. I think as like a person, as a part of a community, like it's great to have queer characters, but what happens when like there are negative ramifications to your like actual queer community of humans who play your game? Are you ready to like kind of stand up for them? And I think that that's super important.
Yeah, and like, and I think once again, we never want to there's always room to do better. I'm not saying this is like, I'm not saying this to give you a corporation, like a company, and say like, let's all listen to this company. No, everyone can always do better. There's always more we can do and grow. Let's not give any one company too much praise. Let's keep seeing more. Let's be happy, let's enjoy, but continue asking for more. And I believe that. But at the same time, like they are one of the bigger companies I have seen do better. And so I would like to see more of what they've done, because I have seen other companies that have something come up and they sweep it under the rug, or they're like, oh, they just like, they let it kind of slide. And Bungie, every time I've seen them, they're like, no, here's more. In fact, you're complaining. So for like, not even during Pride Month, like, because everyone does stuff during Pride Month. I know that they did a whole round of stuff recently during no specialty month or anything like that, where they're like, here's some free emblems, here's some free, like when you appear into a location, now you can appear in a bunch of rainbows, like here's a bunch of stuff. And when we put that out, they also put out a bunch of posters where like, hey, guess what, this character's ace, here's a beautiful like background, free background, photos for anyone that wants them. This character, like literally every flag, it had something. They're like, here's our trans characters, here's our non-binary characters, here's our like ace characters, like everything, because everyone it's a big world. And guess what, it's going to happen in a big world. There's going to be a beautiful variety of people, and they've been very vocal, and I would like to see more people do that. I would like to see more companies, big companies in particular, because the indie game companies are doing it. They're telling their stories. It's the big companies that need to like step up.
Especially because they're the ones with the resources, right? Like,
exactly.
We talk about hiring consultants, and I still think you should do that, and I think you should factor in your budget doing that, even if you are an indie game developer. But there's something to be said that indie game developers don't have access to the same amount of funding and resources and things that these bigger companies do, and they're still doing better. So what does that really say about what's happening?
Yeah.
Hey. All right. I'm having the time of my life. Could probably talk about this forever and always, but I do have to return the channel back to whoever has it next. So we're getting some final shout outs in chat for all of you. If you all have enjoyed this conversation in chat today, all of these wonderful humans do their own things on the internet in their own corners of the internet. And so if you enjoyed the conversations that we had today, make sure that you follow up by clicking those links in chat and showing them some love, and getting to see what their little communities are about, because they're each unique in their own way. And I think you all will enjoy them. Thank you all for being here and spending your Sunday with me for free being here, sharing some thoughts that you have, and even some of your own personal lived experiences. It's not something you have to do, so I want you all to know that I appreciate it a whole lot. And I
It's so
enjoyed
fun.
getting to know you all a whole lot. But yeah, that's gonna be it for today.
Sweet.
Thank you for the
guys.
space
Yes, of
Yes.
course.
to do this.
Bye,
Yeah.
friends.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye. Okay. All right, chat. So I'm gonna get us a little raid. No worries, Rogue. No worries. Thank you for being here. And if you want to see the rest of the chats before you got here, the VOD stays up on the It Gets Better channel. I think they highlight them, so I think they're there indefinitely. I think you can even go find my ambassador streams from last session if you want to. And I'm gonna find someone who is live from the It Gets Better ambassador crew for us to raid into. If we could get !raid in the chat from one of the mods so that we can get that raid message going. Go put a smile on another wonderful queer human's face. That is the goal. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for our wonderful panelists for being here. And thank you all in chat for hanging out and sharing some of your own stories as well. Ooh, let's see if I can copy this. Bada bing, bada boom. Okay, I see Dan is live from our current ambassadors and Raven, but we rated Raven last time, so why don't we go see Dan today? It looks like he is playing Resident Evil 4 today, although they have not gotten into the game yet. So if you're not a horror fan, I think you are safe to still come along and do the raid message if you'd like, because it looks like he's just chatting at the moment. So if you want to do the raid and then run, if you don't like horror, that's totally okay. I know it's not for everybody. And I will see you all for my next session. I am moving, so it's going to be a minute before I'm back again. So I hope you all are doing well. Take care of yourself and be kind to yourself while I am away. And I'll see you sometime next month. Bye, friends. Bye, 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 bye. Oh, wait, I have to actually click the raid button for us to go bye, 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 bye. Please hold. I promise I know how to stream and that I am a pro streamer. I swear. Here we go. Here we go. There we go. We're zooming. Thank you, friends. Have a good rest of your day. I'll see you in the raid. Goodbye.